Hello everyone. In this video, we are going to provide more examples in applying the alternative definition of the derivative. Okay? So let's try to answer the given problems. For number one, we have f of x equal to sine x. So we need to find f prime of pi over 2. Okay? So in this case, the same pa rin yung gagawin natin. First, we will solve for f of pi over 2. Okay? So f of pi over 2 is just sine pi over 2. So you substitute pi over 2 to your x. And this is equal to 1. Right? So from that, we now have the value of sine pi over 2. Next, we need to solve for f of pi over 2 plus h. So we just need to um, substitute pi over 2 plus h to our x. So we will have sine of pi over 2 plus h. So there. So we now have the derivative, that is f prime of pi over 2, and that is equal to the limit of f of pi over 2 plus h minus f of pi over 2 all over h as h approaches 0. So from that, let's substitute the values. We will have the limit of f of pi over 2 plus h is just sine of pi over 2 plus h minus f of pi over 2 is equal to 1 all over h as h approaches 0. Now, observe that in our numerator, you have sine of pi over 2 plus h. So you are adding two angles here. The first one is pi over 2. The second one is h. And we can actually separate those angles, right? Through the sum or difference of two angles na properties that you have learned sa pre-calculus. Okay, if you can still recall, sine of a plus b is just equal to sine a cosine b plus sine b cosine a. Okay, so therefore from that, we can let our a as pi over 2 and b as h. So therefore, this a here will become pi over 2, b is h, b is h here, then a is pi over 2. So from that, we can now separate the two angles. Okay? So in this case, we will now have the limit of sine pi over 2 cosine h plus sine h cosine pi over 2 minus 1 all over h as h approaches 0. So from that, we know how to evaluate sine pi over 2 and cosine pi over 2. We know that sine pi over 2 is equal to 1 and cosine pi over 2 is equal to 0. So therefore, simplifying this one, so we will have f prime of pi over 2 is now equal to the limit of 1 times cosine h is just cosine h. And 0, sine h times 0 is 0. So this will be canceled out. That will become 0. Then you have minus 1 all over h as h approaches 0. As you can see here, cosine h minus 1 all over h is somewhat similar to the special limit for cosine. If you can still recall, limit of 1 minus cosine t all over t as t approaches 0 is equal to 0, right? So in this case, cosine h minus 1 all over h is almost the same with 1 minus cosine t over t as t approaches 0. And we also have here h approaches 0. So we just need to manipulate something here para magkapareho na yung form niya. And take note, if I'm going to factor out negative 1 from the numerator, I will get the limit of, so factor out natin yung negative. So from cosine h minus 1, factor out natin si negative 1, this will become negative cosine h, right? And negative 1 will become positive 1. And that is just equal to rearranging negative of 1 minus cosine h, right? So therefore, this one will become negative of 1 minus cosine h, which is the same with this one, all over h as h approaches 0. And we can factor out negative through constant multiple rule. So we have negative of the limit of 1 minus cosine h all over h as h approaches 0. And from that, this one is already a special limit. So, and that is equal to 0. So we have negative of 0 or just equal to 0. So for number 1, the answer for this one is equal to 0. Okay? So that's it for number 1. Now for number 2, we have f of x equal to cosine x and we need to find f prime of 2 pi. Okay? So the same pa rin yung gagawin natin. For letter A, we have f of 2 pi and that is cosine of 2 pi. And cosine of 2 pi, we know that is equal to 1. Okay? And f of 2 pi plus h is just equal to cosine of 2 pi plus h. Okay? Now, applying the alternative definition, we have f prime of 2 pi is equal to the limit of f of 2 pi plus h minus f of 2 pi all over h as h approaches 0. So from that, we substitute the values. F of 2 pi plus h is cosine 2 pi plus h minus f of 2 pi is equal to 1 all over h as h approaches 0. Okay? Now, cosine 2 pi plus h, pwede natin yang i-separate. Okay? Using the sum or difference property of cosine, we have cosine of a plus b is just equal to cosine a cosine b minus sine a sine b. Okay? So therefore, we will now have a is 2 pi while b is h. So we will have here 2 pi, here h, then we have 2 pi here, and we also have h here. So we will now have the limit of cosine 2 pi plus h magiging cosine of 2 pi siya, then cosine of h, minus sine of 2 pi, sine of h. Then you have minus 1 all over h as h approaches 0. Now, cosine 2 pi is equal to 1, while sine 2 pi is equal to 0. So from that, we can simplify this one, and that is f prime of 2 pi is equal to the limit of 1 times cosine h is just cosine h. So we have cosine h here, okay, minus 0 times sine h is 0. So this will be canceled out. Then you have minus 1. Okay? All over h as h approaches 0. Okay? So almost the same lang kanina sa number 1. So we will factor out negative. So this will become negative of the limit of 1 minus cosine h all over h as h approaches 0. So from that, 1 minus cosine h is just limit of 1 minus cosine h over h as h approaches 0 is again equal to 0. So you have negative of 0 or just equal to 0. So for number 2, again, that is equal to 0. Okay? So that's it. Now, the last one, Suppose we have e to the power of x. So we need to find f prime of 1. So the same pa rin yung gagawin. A, f of 1 is just equal to e to the power of 1 or just equal to e. Okay? Then we have f of 1 plus h. So that will become e to the power of 1 plus h. So there. Then we apply the formula f prime of 1 is equal to the limit of f of 1 plus h minus f of 1 all over h as h approaches 0. So from that, we will now have the limit of e to the power of 1 plus h minus e all over h as h approaches 0. Okay? Now, take note, e to the power of 1 plus h, ito, we can separate that one. Take note from the loss of exponent. If you have e to the power of 1 plus h, you can separate that one, and that will be e to the power of 1 times e to the power of h, right? So therefore, this one here will become the limit of e to the power of 1 is just e, then we have times e to the power of h, then minus e, all over h as h approaches 0. Okay? And you can see here that e is common. So we can factor out e. So we will have f prime of 1 is equal to the limit of e times e to the power of h minus e divided by e is 1 na lang kasi lumabas na si e all over h as h approaches 0. And you can see that e here now is a constant. So we can factor out e. So ilalabas natin si e. So we will have the limit of e to the power of h minus 1 all over h as h approaches 0. Now recall the third special limit, the limit of e to the power of t minus 1 all over t as t approaches 0 is equal to 1. And from here, they are just the same, right? So therefore, this limit now is just equal to 1. So e times 1 is equal to e. So therefore, the answer for letter number 3 is equal to e. Okay? So that's it for this lesson. Okay? Thank you for watching.